Hello, it's Paul Mason.
Hi, it's Terry Macalister.
Terry, hello. We're meant to talk about the future of education, higher education, university thinking, etc. Where are you?
I'm in Cambridge, so I have sort of very tenuous connections with one of the colleges here, but I'm primarily like you, I'm a journalist. I'm someone who likes to be out in the real world.
Well, I went to Sheffield University. I'm off there again tomorrow to do a talk, actually, and London University to do my teacher training. I've got a good anecdote coming up about Cambridge, which I'll save. We're meant to talk about the future of higher education, university, life, knowledge. There's a list of questions we've been asked to look at, but have you got? Do you want to make any kind of opening statement?
An opening statement. Well, I guess my opening statement would be if ever you were going to choose a moment to talk about um, how life should be reorganized, whether inside some kind of academic institution or outside, now is the moment. I mean, the climate emergency crisis offers that enormous opportunity. And it's a kind of cliche to say that COVID is the kind of dress rehearsal, but we have seen dramatic changes in the way governments, society operates as a result of COVID. Just to give an obvious example, the kind of money suddenly becomes freely available, public money, in a way that it just wasn't before.
Yeah.
And so we've seen that, and we've seen people have gone through a cultural change. Whether that will manifest in really different ways of work or not remains to be seen. But because of that, you can see that the climate emergency, enormous threat, but also an opportunity, a really, really different kind of thinking about how we want to construct the world around us, and how we could help students understand a different kind of world.
Yeah, I've been thinking that when we were all panicking about COVID at the beginning, there was a lot of I wrote some very doomy things about how it's just the latest in a series of what looked like exogenous shocks for capitalism, but they're in fact endogenous. It's the kind of shocks capitalism has not been creating for 200 years, and now it's facing the climate, it's facing basically the bio the kind of biological conditions of existence threatened, as we know, by crossover viruses from the animal and bird kingdom. But I think what we're being asked to talk about in this discussion is how would higher education have to change in order to address both the climate and the social justice issues that the young generation going to university are very aware of. God help them, because when they get there, it's basically a kind of business. It's like it's like a McDonald's, only it sells degrees in many respects. What do we do about that? I've got some ideas, but do you want to fire away?
Well, I haven't been near in a sort of student capacity through that process for rather a long time, clearly. But I've got two boys who are in their 20s and very much just come out of that machine. And my visits to their academic institutions and their experiences are very live with me. And as you say, it's very much a kind of microcosm of what is happening in the wider field, whereby they have become very rapacious financial institutions. And certainly in Cambridge, where the colleges are not only places of learning, but actually property developers in very extreme ways, and are arguably undermining, in many people's views, the quality of life of people who live in the city with that academic institution. It's very graphic to me how universities have gone badly wrong and turned into this, these vastly overpriced, overpaid vice chancellors, and increasingly cost cost-proofed student lives. In particular, I think it's just worth mentioning one tiny thing. I mean, in our book, the Crude Britannia book that I've just written, where we look at fossil fuel companies, we're very interested in the way the impact on culture. And I think it's interesting, the impact on culture of today's academic institutions in terms of debt, which I don't think it is a surprise that Squid Game is the kind of biggest thing on Netflix at the moment. It's about debt, and the people absolutely in the firing line are my sons who have amassed these huge debts, which I didn't have to. That's one manifestation of where things have gone wrong. I'll leave it there, Paul. Tell me.
I think, I mean, I obviously agree with that, but what I would say is that for me, what we're seeing, the whole crisis we're living through is not just climate, it's not just biodiversity, etc. It's biological security. In one of my books published in 2019, I call it the crisis of the neoliberal self. So the neoliberal self was created around market forces, coerced into behaving as if the market is the only arbiter of social behavior. And it blew up in 2008. The whole system blew up. You know, it's got no internal logic. It makes no sense. You know, the idea that the ideology that we need a tiny state and a massive market, and everyone has to stab each other in the back, when we're actually facing a massive collective human scale problem called climate change, which the market has for 40 years failed to solve it in any respect. So I think what I want to do, how it manifests to me in the occasional lectures and interactions I have with students, is this. It's not just that the university as an institution is trying to make everything monetized and make everything vocational, and all success is measured against it. Will it prepare me for the cutthroat work of getting a job at McKinsey or whatever? The problem is it's also creating a student mindset that is very consumerist. So every teacher and lecturer has the horror story of being told by students they don't want to learn certain things because it won't prepare them for the kind of pure marketized economy in which they expect to have to survive. My anecdote that I referred to earlier is about 10 years ago, just after the financial crash, I went to Cambridge to speak to the Department of Land Economics, which is the only surviving Keynesian bit of economics at Cambridge, or was then. Remember, Cambridge is and was Keynes's intellectual home territory, and the guys were trying to sort of bring in aspects of economic history and the history of economic ideas to the economics course, to the economics kind of degree, and they were just the students were just telling them to F off, basically, because they just said, we don't want to learn about Keynes because it's got no relevance to, everybody around us is a neoliberal. All the policymakers we're going to have to work for, all the bankers and the hedge fund guys don't believe in Keynesianism. And it won't help us to become quants, quantitative analysts. And so if you look at it from that angle, what to me would be one of the solutions, because we've been asked for solutions. One is, I think I'd just like to de-link all education from payment. Just literally say, take money out of everything, out of incentivization, out of, so you don't pay, fees, you get a grant, you can live on it for a long time, longer than 3 years if you need to. I would just remove money from the equation, because, there's very little that two white blokes, English blokes, I'm in my 60s, I don't know what you are, can teach young people, to be honest. But one of them is, that's exactly what when I went to university, I got a grant, a full grant, I could live on it. I didn't need to do a job, apart from if I wanted to in the holidays. There was no working during term time in some paid employment. And indeed, as a result of that, there was no compulsion on me. I didn't go to lectures on one part of my course for 2 years because I didn't fancy them. I just thought I'd rather read books and listen to music. I was a music student. And so I think the radical thing to think about is, what if we took all monetary incentives away from education and just made it about education, which isn't, of course, to say it's about some kind of fluffy humanities thing. The education is really rigorous. I mean, in most disciplines now, it has to be rigorous because so many disciplines, not just engineering and maths and science, many disciplines are devolved or revolve rather around, you know, data, statistics, data processing. You can't just you have to have a rigorous education. But I think I would want to sort of say, think about the education as an end in itself before thinking about what you actually want to do. Even if you're on a quite vocational path, like an engineer or you know, a professional economist, give yourself was a kind of famous public school teacher, wasn't there? I think it was Oundle School. The headmaster said, you know, think in an expansive way, because when you study the real path breakers, you know, in the 19th century, you know, the men who invented thermodynamics, you know, they were tinkerers, but they were expansive thinkers. And I would really want any student in my family to come out of university, or at least having tried to do a bit of that.
Well, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think, I mean, the width is important in terms of the sort of breadth of education as well as the depth. And quite clearly, certainly in Britain, we're particularly addicted to sort of depth. And it starts actually before you even get there with A levels, which are very restrictive. 3 kind of subjects, nothing like the kind of continental baccalaureate or what you see in North American, which continues off into tertiary education, where you can take a wide range of subjects. So I understand exactly what you're saying about the importance of not being unworldly or whatever, but and making sure you're rooted in reality in terms of, I think one has to accept that students will have deep insecurity about coming out of an academic institution without, say, formal qualifications, which may be something one could look at, de-ranking academic life. Making it more egalitarian is clearly sort of part of the issue. I mean, we need to think about ways in a structured way that everybody feels comfortable with, where we remove, you know, removing money out of the equation is good. Removing hierarchy out of the equation is good as well. And listening to and responding to the needs of the students themselves and the need for some kind of element of self-governance. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day who's a Cambridge academic and talking about this wider non-grading kind of field, which seems highly attractive. And she was telling me that at University of California, San Diego, they did that. And then there were problems for the students in terms of following on that education because other institutions refused to accept them without a formal grading. So there are all sorts of issues that one would have to think through. But I'm you know, here's a kick back to the thing about, you know, complexity. And that is that I think in a certain way, which will be part of a dialogue I would want in this situation, that there's not too little knowledge for students, there's too much of it. And in many ways, there's a German artist who moved to the States called Annie Albers, and she said, we need to scrape away complex knowledge and find the quietness of vision. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, that we're buried in this world bombarded by facts and figures and knowledge. And the best thing we could do for students would give them time to breathe. You know, I think we're getting on later on to the student experience. There's all sorts of problems with the student experience, but one of the good things about the student experience, certainly for me, and like you, I mean, I did a very sort of vocational, I did a law degree, it was very vocational. which I had very little interest in, but it was an enormous learning period for me, which allowed me to unwind from the institutionalized school experience. And before I got into the institutionalized work experience, it was gigantically important. And I've been away. I left The Guardian, which was very formal, institutional journalism 5 years ago, and become freelance and written books and had much more time to think and breathe. And I'm kind of horrified, actually, that I spent so much time as a journalist in a very, very constrained atmosphere where I didn't have time to think. And now when I look at mainstream media, I'm really, really disappointed by the lack of really creative thinking at the moment when we've got this climate emergency, as we're discussing, the perfect time to really put forward new ideas for how we should be living constrained by the planet. And we're just, you struggle to find that.
I mean, one of the questions we've been asked to address is about, how do we defend the university against the right-wing authoritarian regimes and indeed, far-right movements that want to completely undermine them. I don't know if you've ever come across this blogger, Mencius Moldbug. He's Curtis Yarvin. He's a friend of, he's kind of friend of the alt-right in America, and was cult about 10 years ago because of these blogs he wrote, which lay the basis of a lot of the modern transition from tech libertarianism to authoritarian right-wing thought. And one of the big things he does is attack both the university and the mainstream media in the same terms. He accuses us and the university of speaking ex cathedra. He calls it the cathedral. That is, the university speaks with an assumed authority that it should not have. Now, I would want, in any reform of the university, I would want to maintain that status of, which I think the university has because of its learning, and it is a place above all for learning above everything else. So you can have professors of medieval history, you can have people who are global experts on the Mycenaean culture and the rest of it, and peer review, because one of the big sources, and it's relevant to climate, it's also relevant to racism and sexism. One of the big things that the right is doing is it's attacking scientific knowledge through the back door of non-peer reviewed journals, non-peer reviewed, not non-professional conferences, journals reviewed by amateurs, and then the kind of recent phenomenon of the actual academic who is an academic, who has a tenure maybe at a university, but then starts spewing out unverified right-wing bullshit. All of that is existential, I think, for the university, because you can go back to Heidelberg and Wittenberg, and there was always controversy, in the Renaissance, and some people got their heads chopped off, but in the end, Galileo, is forced to recant. But in the end, we are defending a flawed but continuous tradition. And what the modern far right wants to do is to chop it. And it will use both weapons: the weapon of marketization. That's the softening up barrage. So everything has to meet a market metric. It has to be immediately useful. And the product of the university has to be an immediately useful worker for capitalism to exploit. And at the same time, it will attack the practices that have been continuous in order to then throw in what it wants to throw in, the defense, the systematic defense of irrationalism, race science, evolutionary psychology that claims women are destined to be subordinate to men, and of course climate denial. So I want to be careful that in reforming the institutions of higher education, we also defend them against that attack from the right. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I think, that's a very compelling and important argument, and you've been concentrating on, through your your great book.
How to Stop Fascism, available in all good second-hand bookstores.
You know, it's so you've been really sort of drilling down into that kind of area. I guess I've been moving in the opposite direction, which is good to hear you say we need some kind of balance. And certainly, as I said earlier, I mean, there obviously has to be a balance in terms of intellectual rigor and sort of recognizable sort of qualitative results from a course, say, run by the New School of the Anthropocene. But to concentrate on the further field where I think that the existing institutions are failing, not just in terms of offering a very sort of insufficiently diverse experience academically, but I also think you know, there needs to be intellectual maturity. There needs to be emotional maturity. And I think that's a sort of big minus figure at the moment in the academic experience. There is no point in having facts without self-knowledge. Mm. And I would really hope that any new kind of way of doing things would look into how that is realizable. So I mean, one of the things that I'm very interested in the arts playing a sort of central role. I'm in a city which is very science-based, and so I endlessly find myself surrounded by academics, particularly when we're discussing things like climate change and climate action, about, no, but we need more evidence-based facts. And I've had enough of evidence-based facts. We heard Margaret Thatcher talking about the climate emergency. She didn't use that word in 1989. You know, she was a chemist, she was a scientist, she saw what was going to happen, she talked to the UN about it. We've known about this for a long time. The reason that we haven't taken action is nothing to do with not having enough facts or science. It's about other stuff, which you know only too well. And so how do we sort of generate that through a sort of, you know, the creative arts and writing and performance and painting? These kind of representations are given lower and lower status, as we can see the sort of attack on this kind of area. And I just say two things that in terms of, if we had a new school and a curriculum and events that were going to take place, I would like to see things like, you know, imagining a different future. I think that's one of the things we failed to do with climate. We failed to offer a vision of the future that people can buy into. And in my book, Crew Britannia, we actually physically did this. We took over, we took into public ownership a wind farm. We actually chartered a boat. We went out into the Mersey and we actually read from a poem by Norman Mackay, where we sort of took back ownership from the financial owners. Now that was a sort of gesture. We've done it with the River Cam as well, because they're under threat. So we read a rights of the River Cam. We want to see the Cam, a river, having the same rights as human beings. Now, on a legal basis, of course, the lawyer will say that's nonsense. There's no legislation to enact that, although there has been in other countries. But to actually do the experience, to, you know, half a dozen of us decided we'd do this. Within 5 minutes, there was 150 people who wanted to be involved in that. Huge amount of, can I come and read a poem? Can I come and paint something? Can I come and speak? Can I play music? That creativity that comes from, you know, offering, let's envisage something very different. I'd love to see that inside a new institution.
Yeah. I mean, for me, thinking about how to reculturalize or reculture the university, I'm thinking about what made my time at university incredibly culturally enriching was the fact that I felt a part of a community. Now, that community was necessarily hierarchical at that point, and there are downsides to that. But, you know, I mean, in the sense that if you remove money from the equation and stop people thinking that, in other words, lecturers are providers and students are clients for a service, and think about that they are all part of a community, which, you know, obviously it's easy in a place like Cambridge or Oxford, harder in one of the newer universities. But in fact, you have to realize that you are part of a continuous Western tradition that, you know, has its roots in antiquity and in Islam. You know, so we are part of a 2,000 year plus intellectual tradition that has been created in the Western Hemisphere that we should be wanting to keep alive and critique at the same time, occasionally tearing down the odd statue as we go. But you cannot have that community if money is coursing through the veins of the university. I honestly think that, you know, I don't want to look back at my time at Sheffield with any kind of nostalgia, because it was also quite rough and quite, you know, sort of unsatisfactory. But that whole arrangement of, you know, being in a refectory, eating one's meals with other students, sitting, we didn't have a top table. The lecturers who lived in the halls sat with us, and what you were able to do is you learned an art of conversation. You were able to talk about the big things that are happening in the world, you know, at the time, and there was a shared cultural life. Now, I think that cultural life can't be just kind of, you know, Western classical music anymore, or, you know, Shakespeare and Goethe. It's got to be the cultural life of the whole world. But I think I look at modern universities and what is missing. What's missing is the sense of culture, the sense of community between people who have authority and people who are the users of the university, i.e. the poor old students paying their £9,000 a year, borrowing their £9,000 a year. I think I wouldn't want to go back, but I want to go forward to a situation where there was some ability to attempt to create a more non-hierarchical community, but the community nevertheless, because you know, I did this weird degree, music and politics dual, because I wanted to switch to politics as a lifelong musician. They wouldn't let me. So I just ended up doing a kind of weird, unofficial dual degree. But in both faculties at Sheffield, I remember really looking up to senior people who had, you know, made their reputations in that field, and feeling I was incredibly lucky to be able to share physical space, have a coffee, argue with, you know, I really feel that a lot of that seems to have evaporated, except at elite institutions. So I was been thinking, you know, if Apple can reinvent the shop, you know, an Apple store is so unlike a normal shop. Why couldn't we get our heads around reinventing the university so that all the barriers fell away to the creative and diverse community?
Yeah, lots of interesting things there. What a wonderful course to have done. I mean, I'd love to have done music and politics. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the. I mean, we used music in Crew Britannia, and actually it was turned down by a very famous publisher on the basis that they wanted to throw that out. They didn't like that at all. That was confusing to a reader, and we were insistent. And the music is used, and there's a soundtrack that goes with the book if you want to use it. But we have, you know, some of the lyrics we use, and this is partly to reflect the way culture has been influenced by fossil fuels, but it's partly a kind of literary trigger, because music brings a different part of, you know, attracts a different part of our kind of body. It's a very emotional thing. And so it's the sort of, I don't think things should be separated. They should be sort of brought together as far as possible. And one would hope that it would be possible inside an academic institution where you were bringing all these different sort of elements of say the written word and performance and music and film and cinematography together. Interesting, I found, in terms of Extinction Rebellion and sort of climate activism. One of the great things about it is the dialogue that goes on, furious dialogue in many instances, where a lot of anger from young people to older people of my kind of generation over what we have failed to do, and quite understandably so. But it's interesting, I hadn't come across that in that sort of form. And I think you were alluding to elite institutions, probably thinking about Oxford and Cambridge and the tutorial system where there is this much more sort of personalized dialogue, but it's still sort of strictly or generally, there's some wonderful examples who do things differently, but generally they're sort of fairly hierarchical, and there's only one tutor in charge, that's for sure. Just finally, you mentioned the Apple shop and kind of how do we create modernity, and it slightly sort of chimes with what I was saying before about how we have to dream this new kind of world, whether it's in an institutional framework, but in a commercial framework. It's interesting that the oil companies, in many ways, the first big extractive industry, have been replaced by this new privacy extracting industry,
data extractivism,
called big tech. And the Shell garage and the Shell imaging was all built on kind of, if you want to join the modern world, you get with linoleum, you get with plastics, you get with petrol. That is modern life, and a lot of pop music reflects that sort of have sex in your car and personal freedom, and it's all that sort of cool thing. But Apple, yes, indeed, have created this kind of different kind of shop because they're trying to create, this is the future, and people do want that future. And I think it's interesting that they've done that, and they've obviously in stock market terms, they've completely replaced the oil companies with their valuations are stratospheric compared to the oil companies. But so I agree. I mean, it would be great to look at ways to create that future-looking world inside a kind of academic framework.
To get there, we might have to allow universities to compete with each other on non-standard metrics. And what I mean by that is, if you want to, obviously there's these rankings of publications, how many publications, or have you patented things, or have you won a Nobel Prize or similar. There's very little in the way of, hey, I want to do it completely different. My metrics will be, our university, you sign up, you may have to still pay $9,000 a year, but it's going to be completely different. There's just no room like that. And in a way, bearing in mind that the lessons that there were some private universities in the Thatcher era, the original trailblazers of the vocational business university were really outliers, and most universities were traditional Enlightenment academic institutions, and they've all adopted that sort of business school type mentality. So you need new entrants to be able to come in. One of the other things that they've asked us to talk about is how do we bring the work of the body, craft, skill and feeling into the university. And this is very interesting to me because I've done a bit of work with one drama school, which is a drama school that's not in it, it's part of London University, it's not in the university context. And it's quite interesting that a long time ago, in the 80s, I was teaching at Loughborough University as a music specialist in the English and drama course. And there, the poor drama students were like trapped on a campus with engineers and sports people, albeit sports people is also the work of the body. It was interesting, both experiences. I would prefer, if possible, to bring ballet, music academies, conservatoires, etc., into the general life of a big university in a big city, because I think that you can still have your department, you can still go and do what you want to do there, but it's interesting that all those the cultural practice type courses for some reason seek seclusion. I've got a place near where I live, the City and Guilds Art School, which is a lot of foreign students, and it's not really part of anything else. They sort of, they have their own pub and they have to sit in the square full of oil paint, and it's great for them. But what you're not getting is you're not getting the crossovers, and so it leaves the standard city university quite denuded, I think, at times, of artistic and cultural creation. And you can all, you can only live a fully rounded human life, I think, if you have access to this stuff and are surrounded by people who, especially when you're young, want to create it. We've got 1 minute left. You have the final word.
Yes.
Well, no, okay. In relation to that interesting comment, all I would say is two things. One, we need to, in the academic institutions need to look outwards and into the world of work and bring the world of work, not for formally because it's work, but the people involved in that, say, menial work is important for exposure. And also people in a university situation should be serving in the canteen as well as creating works of art, as well as planning to learn coding.
When do I start?